All right, so Chapter 11 is about access control methods. And what we're going to do is talk about the different access control models. And there are a lot of them, and we'll talk about each one. And we'll talk about some topics that are going to make sense to y'all, even if it's something you haven't thought about as something that is a security control, like an implicit deny, or, one of my favorites that not very many places do is a job rotation and mandatory vacations. And as employees, we all love that, a mandatory vacation. But if you stop and think about it, there's a very good reason for that. If you're doing something squarely on a network and you're forced to take a 2-week vacation once a year, that's time someone else is doing your job. That's the opportunity for them to see you're doing something squarely. So that's why, why there's a reason for that. And we'll talk about ways that you can create and enforce policies. We're also going to talk about users, groups, permissions, rights, and policies on a network. Now, because the Security Plus is generic, this is not specifically talking about Active Directory, but that is the way, you usually accomplish this. Most businesses are going to be running Windows servers. They just are. And because of that, they'll have Active Directory, and they'll do these things in that with different groups and users and templates. And their security templates and policies will be done as well. All right, so basically access control is just the way that you control access to some asset. Now, based on what kind of operating system you're using, but normally we consider an asset to be like an object. And an object might be a person, it might be a computer, it might be a printer, it might be a piece of software. One thing about Active Directory and other models that people like is everything is treated as an object. Therefore, you have access control to everything. For normal use, we don't do it, but in here, if we had AD, I could set that printer where you could only print between the hours of 8 and 4, or you could only print from this computer, or this user could print from anywhere, but this user could only print from this place, and this user can only print from 9 to 1, and this user can only print from 1 to 5. And of course, I mean, with a printer, that seems crazy, but there are good reasons to do things like that on a network. Lots of places like banks will set lockouts where you can't log into the network after a certain time because no one should be in a bank at 9 p.m. logging onto a network. So the major types, first is discretionary access control. And this is an access policy that is determined by the owner. You, as the owner of an object, you set control to it. A very simple example of this is if you have a Windows share on your computer and you put a password on it, that is a discretionary access control. You have put a password, somebody's got to enter that password to get to that. You, as the owner of that object, control that. A mandatory access control is a policy defined by a computer system, not by the owner itself. Maybe as an Active Directory, as the admin, I push that policy onto you. I don't let you have control over it. If I want your C drive shared, I'll share it for you. And when you get into things like rights and things like that with users, you don't want to say that your users are dumb, but I prefer to use the term ignorant of security. And the reason I say that is, the old example I used to always give in networking when talking about wireless, we all lock our houses when we leave. We know that. Humans know to lock their door. Most people know to lock their door. You got to do the same thing electronically, but people don't know how or don't realize they should lock their electronic door. Using examples in personal, I told y'all before I moved, there was a little old lady somewhere close to my house with a network named Linksys that was a DSL connection. She had no idea that the whole neighborhood was using her wireless. I'm sure that it never occurred to her that her network was wide open or what that meant, So mandatory is taking that control out of the user because the user doesn't know what's best for themselves most of the time. A role-based access control is not unlike mandatory control, but it is not by the owner of a resource. And then finally, attribute is dynamic and context aware. Attribute-based controls deal more with like getting into specifics on read-write and what exact controls you're going to do on a system. And there are different reasons to do different things, you know, like taking a file system on Linux or on Windows. You got read, you got write, you've got execute, and you've got modify. Sometimes I want to give you access to create a file, but then I don't want to allow you to delete it. Or maybe I won't give you access to create a file. You can only modify a file that's already there. Or lots of times read access. Maybe I'm the boss and I've got a directory of files I want y'all all to download. I don't want you to modify any of it. I'm going to give you only read access to it. So we have a couple of practices that are generally used in access control. Implicit deny, this is the idea that you should always use on a firewall. For those of you in the Cisco course, this will really kind of hit home. If you've looked at firewall ACL rules, you know, usually your last rule is deny all. And the reason for that is if we have a deny on everything, then we go back and we add rules in front of it to allow a few things. We are not letting anything through except things we specifically want through. On a firewall, you block everything, then you only open the ports you need access to. The concept of least privilege is one that, is weaved throughout security. You only need enough rights to do your job. This is, I know, a total pain. I hear faculty gripe and moan about it a lot. I'm sure you guys in IT hear it all the time. You don't have rights to do things on your computer so that you can't do anything that can damage your computer or the rest of the network. You know, it's one of the issues we talked about single sign-on before. If your password is compromised, it's not just the computer in your office that it's compromised on. Now it's compromised on Moodle and MyNSU and all these great things. If somebody were to get my password, they could go in and change their grades. I mean, it's a simple thing. So giving people the least privilege on their computer is important. This keeps them from being able to install things, and do things they don't need. Generally, you don't let anyone be admin on their machine. That's just a rule, period. Another concept is the separation of duties. And this is when it takes more than one person to complete a task. This is an old military idea. You've all seen the military movies, where they're going to enter the nuclear code and you have the two keys. It is basically that, but not even a physical thing. Maybe a separation of duty might even just be to a password, but no one person would have the whole password. If it is something that is extremely important, maybe I give one user part of the key and another user the other part of the key. And those two people have to come together and agree and both enter the password to move forward. And then job rotation. This is one that a lot of places have issues with because you get good at one thing and they tend to like you doing that thing. But job rotation, the idea is I move you from job to job so that if you're doing something, like I said earlier, something squirrely or you've got something running on your network that you're hiding and I don't know about it, maybe whoever I rotate into your job will realize it. So it's a good thing to move people around even though it is, a retraining at sometimes. So, all right, user accounts can be added to computer networks. We all know that. Active Directory is a Windows thing, Active Directory users and computers. You have good control over how you can create those users, especially in Windows. And, we could do an entire class on just Active Directory, and that's something that may happen in the future because I would like to do more Windows courses. But basically, what becomes important in this is that you come up with a scheme and you stick to it. Some of the ways they're done here, for example, there's a group for students that every student's in. There's a group for faculty that every faculty member is in. There are then groups for colleges. There's a group for the College of Business that all the College of Business students are in. Then there's a group for CIS that all the CIS students are in. Then in Moodle, there's a group for every class. you're in this class, so you're in a CIS3980SP18 group. And that is done so that they have control over what you're able to do outside of that. A prime example, if you log into the 24-hour lab, if you are a CIS student, you have admin rights in there. Those machines eventually overwrite themselves. It doesn't matter. You're given that so you can install software. If you're a liberal arts student and you come log in that lab, you can use the computer and the printer. You're not an admin. You do not have rights to install software in that lab. You know, that's just one example of the way things are broken up. But that is so you have absolute control over the system if you want it. That goes back to my example, you know, using groups. I could say that, you know, only the security group, only the ones of y'all that are in this class can print in that lab from 1 to 2 o'clock. Or, you know, only you in this class can log in. We had them take it off, but it used to be that students could not log into the faculty machines in the front of the rooms. And that was, from their standpoint, a security thing. The issue became, you know, if one of you wanted to do a presentation, you had to get a faculty member to come log in for you. So we asked them to change that so that students could log in. That's the other piece of this. It can all be very dynamic. You change this stuff a lot based on what your needs are. So groups can classify users with assigning a permission. If I put you in a group, that group is an object in my Active Directory. I can assign that group rights just like it were a student. So instead of having to go to each of you in my little printer example and say you can print from 12 to 1, I say that group can print from 12 to 1, and if you're in that group, this is what you can do automatically. So permissions for file and print access are assigned, again, to individual users or groups. Just because you're in a group doesn't mean that I can't do a rule that gives you an exception. Groups have something, and they don't call it this in here, but it's called inheritance. You inherit the rules of the group because you're in that group. But I can explicitly give you rules if there's a reason. Going back to my example, I let you all print from 1 to 2, but maybe one of you I want to let print from 1 to 3 for whatever reason. So I go in and assign you those privileges, and that will override your inheritance in the group. A lot of this is done with what's called an access control list, or an ACL. An ACL is permissions assigned to an object. They reside on firewalls, they reside on routers, they reside on computers. Y'all have looked at you know, switches. You've noticed you can put them on a switch. Getting ahead of myself and where y'all are at in Cisco, but you can assign an ACL to a VLAN. So that gives you very, very specific control over what things can do what. And notice this is how all this works together. You have multiple control in multiple places. Because everything is an object, I can give you permissions on one system and not on another. And on a big network where everything is treated the same, those permissions can fall through. What I mean by that is it doesn't necessarily have to be in one place. If we had a 24-hour lab at Shreveport, which I think there is I don't know that it's 24-hour, but there's an open lab on the Shreveport campus. You can go up there and log in with your credentials just like you're sitting here. It's not 24, but you know, whenever it's open, you can go up there and log in. And I don't know if they've got printing and all set up, but they could have it set up where you could print using your print allotment from here, because Active Directory doesn't care where the login is as long as it's into an Active Directory server. All right, so on NTFS, that is the general file system that everything Windows uses. You know, we're going to talk specifically about it, but the ones for Linux, for ext3 and 4 file systems, are almost the same. The ones for Apple's file system, which is HPFS, they're almost the same as well. You have a full control permission, which means they can do everything. You have a modify permission. Modify means you can change a file, but not necessarily create a file. Read and execute are put together. The reason it's read and execute and not just execute is you've got to have permission to read the file in order to be able to execute the file. However, I can give you read permission that doesn't include execute, where you could read a file, but you can't necessarily put an exe file in that directory and run it. And then a write permission, of course, is to write files. List folder contents is one that's a little bit more NTFS specific. I'll let you see the files in a folder, but I may not let you read it. List folder contents and write. Before we had Moodle, one of the things they used to do was make their own Dropbox for students to turn assignments in. And on the server here, the way that was accomplished is there was a folder called whatever class, and you would have write access and list folder contents access. So you could write the file to that directory, but then you couldn't look at it again, but you could look at the folder listing to see that your file got put there. So that's an example of why you might need a little crazy permission sometimes. All right, so again, with everything in security, you can't stress it enough, but with file permissions, you want least privilege. If a user doesn't need to be writing something to a directory, there's no reason to let a user write to that directory. And then I mentioned this earlier, but permission inheritance. Permissions on files are handled just like they are with users in groups. Unless you turn inheritance off, if I give you access to a folder, you have access to all the subfolders and files under that folder. So unless I specifically disallow a file in that folder, you'd have access. An example of that, like we rarely use it, but I have a public folder on my server. And right now the public folder is set so everyone has read-write to everything in there. But if I wanted to put an ISO image in there and not let any of you delete it, but I want you to be able to download it, I could go make it read-only, and you could download that file, but then you couldn't do anything. You couldn't overwrite it. All right, so how is all of this handled? Generally, the way we do access control is a username and password. Naming conventions don't really matter as long as they're consistent. When you get a large network, having names the same way becomes important. Lots of places that I've worked use first name dot last name. That is LSUS, LSU, all your email and everything, it's first name dot last name. Here, generally, it's last name, first letter of first name, unless that account is taken. I'm the weirdo here. Mine's backwards from everybody else's. And the reason mine's backwards is because there's an Emily Horton that teaches in nursing. And she gets a lot of emails from me, by the way. So what becomes important there is that you come up with a convention and stick to it. You want something that's somewhat unique because, if you use the last name first letter, J. Smith, all right, one of the most common names you can come up with, you're going to have to put numbers on it. You're going to have a J. Smith 1, 2, 3, whatever. Students, the way students are handled here, that's why part of your student ID is in your email address, because that makes it super unique. Again, with that, it's one of those things like naming computers. It doesn't really matter what you do, but come up with something that will help you to remember it and kind of stick with it. We don't do it in this room because we clone the computers and everything in here is named the same. But if you look at the computer names in the labs, you notice they're all like 10-101A- Do what? Oh, they are changed in here. Good. They're not the same now. But 10 is the building number of Russell Hall on campus. So 10-101A-05. If the admins are looking at something, they know immediately 10-101A, they know where that computer is. All they got to do then is figure out where number 5 is, and if they're numbered in order, it's easy to find. So how passwords are set, all right, they're either created automatically or, by the administrator. Most places have a common password that's set, and then you're required to change it when you first log in. That's just the way a lot of places are done. Complexity requirements are something that I always find super interesting because, and I've said this to the CEH class. You want it a good password, but if your user is going to write it down, there's no sense in making it. What they suggest, and this is just, again, suggestion. You really got to go with what the needs of your company are. Upper, lower number, 1 special character, and 8 to 10 characters. That works for some. It doesn't for others. All right, so one of the things about users with passwords is, again, users sometimes don't know what's good for them. Users will walk away from their computer and forget to log out. Some things you should do on a network, though, is disable the guest account. Guest has a good purpose. Guest is turned on in here. And let me tell you why it's turned on in here, because we don't have usernames and passwords, and I wanted all of y'all to be able to get to the public, share public without a username and password. If we were security-minded, what we would do is set up Active Directory, and I'd create a user account for every user. It's just that that would be something manual for us and would take a lot of time. And basically, it would take me putting all the users into the system, and I'm not going to do it. So another one, and this surprises a lot of people, but don't disable Control-Alt-Delete. The reason for that is Control-Alt-Delete used to be the reset command on an old DOS system. By pushing those keys, you are actually sending a command that goes to the BIOS of the computer, not to the operating system. Now, keyloggers have gotten smarter now. They know how to intercept it. But in the old days, you couldn't get around a keylogger with a Control-Alt-Delete. An issue with that, and it goes a little beyond the scope of what we're looking at here, but hardware keyboard loggers don't matter. It doesn't matter what you push on a keyboard if they're intercepting it at a hardware level. But that's still a good way to make sure your users are entering their passwords properly. I've not tried it. I've read some things about how you can do this. An additional security piece I'm going to mention is that go into the Windows registry and set it where it doesn't show a dot every time you hit a character. That will confuse your users for a while, but it adds security. Now, why does that add security? I don't know how long it is exactly. It will take me way longer to brute force it if I don't know the number of characters. And then again, use policies. Use policies and enforce those that govern user accounts. Set them where users have to log out after so much inactivity. One big one that I suggest everywhere do, lock the screen at minimum after there's been no typing for a few minutes, so that if a user does get up and walk away, you've got an answer for them. So Windows has a level of security called user account control. And what this is very much the way they go into what Linux has done for a long time. UAC means that you are a normal user until you need to be an admin for a certain reason. Like on all of your laptops, whatever, how many of y'all have got Windows 10? Well, it's even in 7. You've gone to install a piece of software. You put Wireshark on, a little message pops up, is this okay? Do you want to install this? That is user account control. And what's happening there is you are moving from being a normal user to being an administrative user to do that task. To tie that to Linux, we've done a little Linux in here. I know a lot, not a lot, but when you type sudo space in a command, you're doing user account control. You're becoming the super user to run that one command. That's basically what we're doing here. We don't want the computer to be an administrative level at all times, because administrative level has access to everything. This will even stop a lot of malicious software, a lot of viruses from being installed, because you got to hit that button to install it. Now, the issue is, of course, a user thinks it's something good and says, oh, yeah, I want to install Coupon Printer. Well, that's the problem. So in this chapter, there's 10 true, false, and 10 multiple choice. Assuming the labs will run, there's a lab on how to create a user on a Windows server. Take a look at it. I don't know that that will actually be on the exam for y'all, but it's a good thing to know how to do. If it's not working, you'll get to see that again in the server class, so not a huge deal. But be sure you understand from the reading the different types of access control methods. Some of the questions that were on my security exam were, they gave you a little scenario with a paragraph and said, this is how it's set up, and then you needed to tell them what type of access control that was. Was it a discretionary, a mandatory, whatever. Make sure you understand the differences in them. Y'all have any questions?